Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're looking at authorization. So we know how to authenticate someone so they log in, but what do we do about once they're logged in? How do we know who they are? How do we know if they can go somewhere or not? How do we stop them from going somewhere? And so on. So those are the questions we're going to answer in this video. So let's get started by creating a new project. A Blazor app. Call it Blazor app. And we'll call this the authorization demo. I have a hard time talking and typing at the same time. ASP.NET Core 3.1 Blazor server app HTTPS, but hit change here to change to individual user account. No need for us to recreate going through and setting up that authentication again. We could use the way to do it right away, which is the easiest way of doing it. We hit create. And now we have our app and we're all set up for authentication. In fact, let's do this. Then you will have a problem where you can't actually use roles. So make sure you have that. Otherwise, you'll have a little bit of an issue. All right, so now we have that. What we're going to do is we're going to create a page that when you go to it, if the user is a certain user, we're going to make sure that they're an administrator. And what this is good for is your initial setup of your database. Because when you first set your database up, no one is an administrator. And so if you have a GUI for adding users or adding roles to users and changing user information, you have to have an administrator. So instead of doing that manually, which you could do, what we're going to do is we're going to create a page that will find a specified user and bump them up to admin. And it's also going to make sure that we have all the roles necessary to function. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to come over to pages and we're going to add a new page. I could do this right in index, and that way it's always going to run the first thing. The problem is it's always going to run the first thing. This is only something I want to do occasionally. So I'm going to create a page dedicated to it. That way it doesn't have to get run all the time. It's just an efficiency thing. And we're going to call this setup admin or setup roles. How about that? And what we're going to do is we'll put on this page, this page has now set up the roles and marked the appropriate user as administrator. Okay? That's all this page is going to say. All the magic is going to happen in the code, or all the good stuff. So let's start off with giving this a page, and we'll give this page the path of setup roles. And we're not going to put it in the navigation. This is just for us to know about as administrators. Using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core identity. And now we're going to inject two values here. We're going to inject role manager, identity role. And we're going to call that, let's call this role manager like this. Role manager. There we go. And then inject user manager, not username, user manager, identity user. And we'll call this user manager. Okay, so now we're getting from dependency injection the role manager and the user manager. Where do they come from? Well, they come from the configuration we have here for our identity. Identity user, identity role. These are what are being put into our identity system, and now we're asking for those back from the systems, the managers that create them. Okay? So now that we have this, let's create a private async task. So it's an asynchronous method called setUpAuth. And in here, we're going to create first our roles. Now again, this is just the startup. We can create a GUI where an administrator can add more roles, they can add more users to roles, and so on. So we're just going to create the basics to get our application going. So I'm going to create a string array called roles and put in it just administrator. All right, and that's it. Now I could put comma and another value and comma and another value, and that may be helpful if you had, let's say, 3 roles you always wanted to have, or this is the foundation for our application. Go ahead and do that. You could also pull from a database right here and populate it from a database and then create the roles dynamically. It's up to you. I'm using an array here so that if you want to add more, you can very easily. I'm going to do a for each role in roles. So again, if you add more than one role here, it will add all of these roles. Var role exist equals await role manager dot role exists async and pass in the role. So what this is doing is checking to see if the role already exists. If role exist equals false, so it does not exist, await role manager dot create async new identity role, and it's going to be role. All right, so roles are just names. That's all they are. They're strings. Now, some people may get a little quirky about the fact that these are what are called magic strings. The idea that it's a string that you put right in your source code, and wouldn't it be better if we could inject that some way? Like I said, you can pull this from a database, but you're going to use this quote-unquote magic string later unless you really work hard not to. And at the end of the day, your roles should not be changing that much that you're considering a way to inject what roles can do what. All right, so just note, I don't get too caught up on using strings. It's okay. but if you really want to, there are ways around using the strings directly. In this side of things, you can pull this from a database and just populate this roles array from a database, and then the rest is good to go. On the other side, be a little harder, but you can do it. Okay, so now we've created our roles if they don't already exist, which means we can call this over and over and over again. It will only ever create the roles once, which is a safety thing. Now we need to get information from the configuration from appsettings.json, which means we need to put some settings into appsettings.json. So admin user, and I'm going to say tim@iamtimcorey.com. So this is where you specify who is the default administrator, the foundational administrator. You can add more administrators later. You could even then remove Tim if you decide to later, but this is the person that's going to start off as an administrator. So I'm using my own email address here. Note that yes, this is an appsettings.json. No, it's not encrypted. Yes, a user could change this later. But if your users have access to your appsettings.json file, they already have control of your application, at least on a web server, which is what a Blazor application is. So this is okay to put here. All right. So we're going to call for admin user. So when you come back over here, we need to add or inject one more thing. iConfiguration, which we have to add a using statement for using, I believe it's Microsoft.extensions.configuration. I get lazy that control dot. It makes my life easy. iConfiguration, we'll call this config. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to say var user equals await user manager dot find by, let's try and spell this right, find by email async. There we go. So we're going to find by email async. We're going to pull in from config.getValue. And I already forget what that value was. Let's go with string first of all. And the value was, I believe, admin user. Sounds about right. And then we put our semicolon. And let's make sure that's what it was. Admin user. Yes, it was. Okay, so we're going to pull from our config a string value for admin user. That's going to give us our email address to look up and find by email async. So what this does is it goes out to our authentication system and says, hey, do you have a user whose email address is tim@iamtimcorey.com? And if so, put that person in the user variable. And if not, put null. So now we can say if user is not equal to null, meaning you found tim@iamtimcorey.com, await user manager dot add to role async user, and the role is going to be administrator. Okay, so we're going to add that user to the administrator role. Now, after you pass in the role here. But my thought is we're really just wanting to add them to an admin user or an administrator group or role, so that then they can add themselves to other roles, or they can add roles to other people as well. So that was my thought process. It's up to you how you want to run this, but just note that's what I was thinking. Okay, so there's our private async task setup auth. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say protected override. And this is on parameter set async. And it's going to mess up my formatting because awesome. All right, let's come down here and let's shift tab. There we go. And we can get rid of this. And we have to say async in front because I didn't put that by default. And we're going to say await set up auth. All right, so now when the onParameter set gets run, it's going to set up the authentication. Okay, or actually authorization, sorry. It's going to set the roles, and if the user exists, which right now it doesn't exist, but if the user exists, we're going to create add the role to that user. So now we have all of this information. Whenever we go to this page, set up roles, it's going to add the user to those roles. All right, so let's put a hold on this and start using our roles, and then we'll create, as far as setting up in the pages themselves, and then we're going to create our user and see how this all plays out. I know it's a lot of setup, but it's going to be worth it in the end. I'll explain the different pieces of it. Okay, so let's start with the counter page. The counter page is a really important, really top secret thing that only authorized users should do. So I'm going to say that you have to be logged in order to use the counter page. So at the very top, you can say @attribute and then say authorize. And what that does, if you've ever used the authorization attributes in like ASP.NET Core MVC or Razor Pages or even ASP.NET MVC, it's the same thing. It's the same attributes. So authorize. And this is saying you have to be authorized in order to get to this page, meaning you have to have logged in. So they will not be able to see the counter page at all if they're not authorized. Let's go to the fetch data, and weather forecasts are even more secretive. So not only should we put an attribute for authorize, we should also say that you have to be in the administrator. You can put comma and then another value if you want more than one role. But so now the fetch data, you can only go here if you're an administrator. All right, let's launch this and see how it works. Okay, so we have our page launching. And right now, if you go to counter, it says not authorized. If you go to fetch data, it says not authorized. Okay, so let's register. So IamTimCorey.com, my super secret password, and I will register. And it's going to say, hey, do you want to confirm your account? Yes, I do. Now let's go back here. We still can't go to counter or fetch data because we're not logged in. So let's log in. I'm going to log in. And now I can go to counter. Notice I can click the values, but if I go to fetch data, I'm still not authorized because I'm not yet an administrator. Now, to add me to the administrator group, we need to go to that page that we created, set up roles. Now, whenever you add a role to a user, it doesn't get applied right away. You have to have that user log out and log back in. There are ways that are somewhat archaic, but you can trigger an update, but we're not going to dive that deep into it because, in general, this is the way that all permissions work. In order to have the permissions apply, you have to log off and log back on. Okay, so we're not going to worry about this, but I just want to show you that even when I'm logged out, I can go to that page and add those user permissions. So I'm logged out right now. I can't go to counter, I can't go to fetch data. But it's set up roles, I believe. Set up roles. This page has now set up the roles and marked the appropriate user as administrator. Notice I'm not an administrator, and I've done this because there is no control here. I'm not saying, what user would you like to be administrator? That'd be horrible. But because everything is behind the scenes set up for me and kind of hard-coded or pulling from the app settings.json, it doesn't matter if I'm logged in or authorized or not. I can run this and it's safe. The only reason why I put it on setup roles and not on home is because I didn't want this database call for the lookup of roles and the lookup of user to happen over and over and over again. So let's go back to the home page. Let's log back in. And when I log back in, I can go to counter and I can go to fetch data because I am an administrator. I am now part of the administrator group. Let's log out and we're going to register a new user. And let's register Dan at iamtimcorey.com. And we'll have him have the same super secret password. And register and confirm. And now we're going to log in with Dan. And you log in, Dan can go to the counter page, no problem, but he cannot go to the fetch data page, okay, because Dan is not an administrator. All right, so now we have two accounts we can play with, and we also have a third state of not even logged in. So we have not logged in but have no roles, and then logged in, had the role of administrator. So we can close out of this, and now let's talk through the different ways we can add in authorization. You've seen how to do it with the attribute, and this is kind of like the shotgun approach. This is the broad scope. Hey, you can't even go to this page if you're not an administrator. Or in the case of counter, you can't go to this page if you're not logged in. Okay, that's kind of the broadest view. We can dial this in a little more. But first, let's talk about that not authorized message. That's not real great. It's just, 2 words, not authorized, and it's not real clean. It doesn't tell the user what to do. It just goes bleh right there. So before we change this to be a little more focused, let's go and make that message better. So we're going to go to app.razor, and in here in the authorized route view, we can take off this end and add a closing tag. So now we have the ability to put code inside of here. Let's tab that correctly. And inside of the authorized route view, we can have a tag called not authorized. And in here, we can put any code we want. So let's do an H1 tag. We could put a Razor page in here if you want, but we're just going to do an H1 tag. And we'll say, not ops, oops, you don't have access. The page or component you are trying to get to is not authorized. Well, no, let's go with the page you're trying to get to requires that you have more permissions than you currently do. Please either log in or request additional permissions from your administrator. Okay, basically a little better message. That's all it is. We could put links there. Like I said, we could use razor components there. Just make sure you're not authorized or have to be authorized. But whatever you want in this not authorized section. Let's run this real quick so we can see it before we start tweaking and playing with the other things we could do. So we are logged in as Dan, so we can go to counter, no problem. Fetch data. Oops, you don't have access. And there's our better message. All right, so now let's work on making some tweaks based upon who's logged in. Let's close out all of these. I'm actually going to go over to Shared and go to the Nav menu. Well, why do we show this Nav link right here if you're not able to get access to it? Or this link right here if you're not able to get access to it? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide these if you don't have access to them. Why even tempt you to go somewhere that you can't go? Make it simple. So I'm going to Control X to cut out of here. And then I'm going to set up an authorize view. And then in here, I'm going to say authorized. And then here, I will paste that navigation link. So if you're authorized, then you will get this link. Now I didn't do it for this one because I want to do it a little different. Let's cut this out. Let's start again. Authorize view. But this time I want to say roles equal administrator. And then authorized. And then in here, paste that link. So this authorized view is only going to show you this counter link if you're authorized. This authorized view is only going to show you the fetch data link if you're authorized as an administrator. Okay, so there's a not authorized here, not authorized, and this would be if you are not an administrator. Okay, so even if you are logged in, it's not about authentication, it's about authorization. And that's the tricky bit here. Authentication means you're logged in. Authorization means you have permission. So even if you're logged in, you don't have permission to this link unless you are an administrator. Now I'll show you the way I do not authorize in a minute. I want to show you these two navigation links because it makes a lot of sense here. So let's run this again. And now notice that Dan, because Dan's logged in, Dan can see home and counter. Cool. He can only go to the places that he can go to. Let's log out. The counter page went away, okay? Because we can't do anything but go to home. Let's log in, but this time I'm going to log in as myself. And maybe if you're not authorized, you still want to have access to that button. So not authorized, let's give them a button too. But administrators wouldn't like that. And so let's create a new method called admin increment count that is going to say plus equal 50. So if you're an admin, you get to increase the account by 50, not just 1. So authorized view gets the button that says click me still, but it increments the counter by 50. Whereas not authorized view gets the button that still says click me, but it increments by 1. Okay? You wouldn't even know a difference. In fact, let's run this. Okay, so we've got the counter button. If I click it, notice 50, 100, 150, 200. Let me log off. I can't go to counter. Let me log in as Dan. And now go to counter, and he has the very sad 1 at a time counter. Doesn't know the difference, but the administrator does. The administrator knows I'm the big man. I can push the button and get 50 at a time. Okay? So that's how you can mix and match. Because we've got this authorized attribute, but we also have the authorized view for a specific role. Now, just to make sure it's really clear, let's create one more page. Actually, you know what? Nope, let's do it on the home page. Index.razor. So, hello world, welcome to your app. But then down here, we're going to have an authorized view that's going to say, if you're authorized, meaning pretty much anybody, as long as they're logged in, let's have an H1 tag, or H3 tag. Thank you for logging in. Okay? And if you're not authorized, then we're going to have an H3 tag that has a class equal to text danger that says again. If you are logged in and you're an administrator, you'll see both the thank you for logging in and thank you again for serving as administrator. Okay, so let's launch this and just see the differences based upon who's logged in or not. Okay, so thank you for logging in. That's Dan. Dan's going to log out now. And it says, please log in. Well, I can do that. And I will log in as me. And when I do, thank you for logging in. Thank you again for serving as administrator. So that's how you can kind of mix and match authorization on your Razor pages, so you can show or hide menu items, so that you can show or hide things on the page. So you can say you just can't even go to this page if you don't have the right permissions. There's a lot of tweaking you can do. There's a lot of things you can think about and configure, but this gives you those options so that when you're building your application, you can think through how you want things to show or hide or be accessible or not based upon who the user is and what roles they're a part of. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. Now it's time for you to practice what you've learned. Take this code, build it yourself, try it out, try different things, see how to break it, see how to make it work. Maybe try out different scenarios you might have at work or different ideas you might have and see if I've covered everything. And if not, figure out how to make it work. Google it, figured out, and so you really understand how to use this tool well. Because the better you understand the tool and the more you've practiced it, the better off you'll be when you actually go to put this into a production app. Okay? So do that and then come on back for the section wrap up.